We've been looking at the biological evolution of the capacity for language. But evolutionary linguistics looks at other stages too. Are languages still evolving now? It's clear that languages are changing. Here's some Old Welsh from over 1,000 years ago, and I can't really understand any of it. Over the next few hundred years, the language changes gradually until we get the Welsh that's spoken today. This kind of change happens in all languages, but is it evolution? When a biologist looks at two species, like a frog and a shark, they see evolved adaptations. The frog's colouring is an adaptation to living in the jungle, and the shark's sleek shape is an adaptation to moving efficiently through water. It doesn't make sense to ask which species is more evolved, or which is more complex, or which is better. Scientists focus on adaptation. However, people get a bit nervous about applying the idea of evolution to cultural things like languages. And this nervousness is well justified. There is a history of racism and colonialism in the study of language. Many saw English or Western languages as the best, and other languages as primitive or less evolved. Here's Malinowski claiming that in a primitive tongue, the whole grammatical structure lacks the precision and definiteness of our own. Hill also characterizes the tendency for linguists to think that primitive tongues have a multiplicity of forms. This kind of attitude surfaces in the present day as well, like this claim by the Times that Welsh is one of the oldest and trickiest languages in Europe. The idea of one language being older than another doesn't really make much sense. Welsh and English share a common ancestor language and have changed gradually over time. There's no particular year that a language was suddenly invented. What the phrasing really suggests is that Welsh is not a modern, logical language. It's different and therefore alien. It's interesting to note the double standard here. Languages that appear simpler than English are classed as more primitive, and languages that appear more complicated are seen as less refined. Comparing languages in this way is clearly motivated by racist and colonialist attitudes, and is generally not a productive way of thinking about the evolution of language. We might make more progress if we stop thinking about the evolution of a whole language and instead think about the evolution of small parts of the language, like a single word. Here's how I think about it. An evolutionary approach is a framework for explaining what gets copied. Strictly speaking, evolution is not a theory of a particular phenomenon, it's an approach you can take to lots of things. It aims to explain phenomena, not just describe them, and it's about copying in an abstract sense. Evolution has three key ingredients. First of all, things vary in their traits. Second, these traits are copied from other things. And finally, competition. The traits cause some things to be copied more than other things. The paradigm case for evolution is the biological evolution of species. Species varies in size or colour or other biological traits. They inherit those traits by genetic reproduction, and individuals compete to produce natural selection. The parallel of this in linguistics is not the evolution of a language, but the evolution of bits of language like words. Words vary in their length or the way they sound, they reproduce through language use, and they also compete against each other for survival. Let me show you what I mean by using this word, taximeter cabriolet. This is an old word for a vehicle you could hire to take you somewhere, a taxi or a cab. Actually, there are lots of words for this thing, demonstrating variation. Every time we have a conversation, the words we choose to use are copied from words we've heard before. Bill Croft says this is evolutionary inheritance. And finally, these words are in competition with each other. Copying one word means that another is not copied, and some words might be copied more. For example, it's much easier to say cab than taximeter cabriolet, so we might be more likely to copy it. Boyd and Richardson call this a content bias. We tend to copy effective behaviours. But there are other biases in cultural evolution too. We might copy a word because it's being used by a successful person, or we might copy it just because that's what everyone else is doing. This framework for understanding the evolution of words helps explain some things. For example, the frequency of words in competition changes over time. 200 years ago, people were using hackney, but then cab took over and hackney was copied less. The use of taxi appears to be relatively new, but has taken off, maybe because one of the copying biases. So, there's a variety of ways we can refer to this thing. We choose which to copy every time we speak, and we might copy some more than others. These are the ingredients for evolution, and indeed Darwin said that the survival of certain favoured words in the struggle for existence is natural selection. We can take an evolutionary approach to other linguistic items as well. We can look at morphology. For example, 200 years ago, the past tense of burn was most likely to be burnt, but now it's more likely to be burned. Or we can look at syntax. For example, the order of subject, object, and verb in a language has changed over a very long period of time. So, evolutionary linguists are interested in explaining the form and frequency of words as adaptations to various evolutionary pressures. In the next few videos, we'll look at some of those, including our brains, the way we interact, our culture, and our physical environment.